The metagame is pretty good right now, and this OTA feels like it could be a pretty big shakeup. So let's see what's going on. First up, Debrii losing a point of power, going to 3-7. I think this feels like a pretty obvious change that's a little bit like seeing a quarter on the ground and picking it up. Debrii as a 3-8 was being played not just in Ozymandias decks that turned her into a card with upside, but also in decks that just wanted bodies on the board, most specifically in techno-organic virus lists. Debrii and Wilson Fisk have been a 1-2 punch in Supergiant, in TOV decks, in anything playing Ozymandias for an extended period of time now, and the fact is that this is a card that is costed as if it should have a downside. Oh, it's a 3-8, but it's taking up spots on the board. But because of things like TOV and Ozymandias, it just simply isn't actually paying that cost. And so what Debrii ends up being is a card that has functionally very little downside for the single most on-rate stat line at 3 cost in the entire game. Taking a point of power off of her is just recognition of the fact that she is a card whose downside is eminently mitigatable. This is a card that will have a ton of little synergy things that you can do with it. 3-7 that helps your Ozymandias game plan, you're still going to play that. I think this is a still very powerful card, but I will note that her getting nerfed is a bit of a buff to Kraglin, who now becomes clear by 2 points, pretty clearly the biggest 3-drop you can play. I think it might be time to start investigating looking into some Krag. There's 1-point buffs that I don't really think will do anything, and then there's this. The normal flavor of a 1-point buff that I don't think will do anything is taking a card that fundamentally is out of the metagame for a bunch of different reasons and changing it to a card that will remain out of the metagame but has an additional point. Negasonic here is the exact opposite. Goes from a 4-5 to a 4-4 and should change absolutely nothing about how good this card is. Negasonic is a card that is extremely powerful for what it does and not for the numbers that it has. Much like Juggernaut, this is a card that will be a staple in various forms of tempo decks. They don't necessarily all go in the same deck. Juggernaut decks are distinct from Negasonic decks because of the conflicting incentives that those two cards have, but they are still staples of tempo and priority-oriented mid-range lists, and I suspect Negasonic will remain such. There is absolutely no reason why anyone playing Supergiant would be taking this out of their deck at this point. I would argue she's a better card than Supergiant in the deck named after Supergiant. In fact, the only thing that I can see this actually affecting is Cerebro, and that's because it's impossible for any card change to not affect Cerebro if that card change affects power. So C5 loses Negasonic and C4 gains Negasonic, and that's actually literally the only thing I think this will change. Aurora losing a point of power is a little iffy to me as someone who spends a lot of time at the top of the ladder. Sort of naturally puts me in an ivory tower where I don't necessarily have a good first-hand understanding of what things are strong at early ranks. And I do think that this is a case of a card being a little bit stronger at early ranks than it is at high infinite, and so causing people like me not necessarily to underrate it, but it definitely seems like if you're a fan of my videos, you'll probably watch this and you'll be like, why the hell are they nerfing Aurora? And to me, I think it fits in the same group of cards as Darkhawk and Surtur and Doom 2099 every so often, where when this kind of stuff is good, it is extremely easy to play. And Aurora being a deck that is extremely easy to play, extremely easy to conceptualize, I think that's also very important. Like, you're asked to do things and you can easily execute on them top down. You understand what the deck is trying to do, and the output is good enough, especially with the addition of Venus recently to these decks, that it just ends up being powerful. Aurora also notably a deck that naturally includes some meaningful disruptive pieces. Typically there's a Cosmo or a Mobius in there alongside a Spider-Ham. Up to 3 or 4 of those pieces can be included in various Aurora decks, so it also fits in the tech pile subsidy kind of deck. That is another common type of deck to see nerfed, even if top players don't necessarily view it as a balance issue where they are at. And I think that Aurora is definitely one of those cards that falls into both of those buckets. And I can see this nerf actually being justified along those lines. I don't think this is a nerf of a card that was like tearing up top infinite or anything, but I do think it's reasonable for them to try to balance for the meat of the curve here, the meat of the population curve, I should say, where most people are. I would imagine that is an environment that is much more conducive to I play a bunch of guys, I play Aurora, I win a lot of games. Jubilee Silver Surfer is a pretty interesting card going from 4-2 to 4-3 because I'm not really sure what they're supposed to do with this card. To me, it feels like the card, ideally, this effect wants to be cheaper and sort of contrast with the more targeted stuff that Maverick and Stick have. But I'm not sure you could make a version of this that's meaningfully cheaper. Like, here's a card that I've been thinking about as a Jubilee Silver Surfer alt, right? Okoye gets to be a 2-3 that adds 1 power to your deck. What if this was a 2-1 that added its power to your deck? Like, is that the kind of thing you could reasonably do? I'm not really sure. Like, it's the kind of thing where it's like, can you do that? Is that the kind of thing that can happen? A lot of stuff in this space where I'm like, I think that this card wants to be cheaper, but I can't necessarily find a satisfying way to do it. Frankly, it reminds me a little bit of Captain Carter, where it feels like if they ever do find the place where it actually is correctly costed for whatever metagame we're in right now, we're definitely running the risk of like it being way too strong later in a different metagame. So I do think that that is the right kind of card to be cautious with, personally. But going from 4-2 to 4-3, I think my worry is it doesn't really fundamentally change what this card is about or what this card is doing. I've typically enjoyed playing 3-5 Namorita that discounts a little bit more than I've enjoyed playing 4-2 Jubilee that adds, and I don't think that would change for 4-3 Jubilee that adds. And I think largely, if I had to identify one specific problem, is that this card has Lady Deathstrike syndrome, where Lady Deathstrike came out and her power was tied to her ability, and because of that, it was difficult to balance her, because those two numbers are the same number. And what actually made Lady Deathstrike become like an actual functional card that people can balance in Marvel Snap that wasn't just either insanely good or insanely bad, depending on context, is that it was decoupled from the number. And it was now there's two numbers on this card that we can change, right? And I think that it's not something you want to do for a card like this, because a lot of the appeal of the card is that it's like that, right? But it is something that occurs to me as like a direction that could be a path forward that doesn't sort of leave this card as a cursed problem that it's difficult to actually make much stronger. I'm a little bit surprised they fired this buff, because even though I think the numbers probably justified it, this is still a pretty scary card to take shots on, and I do kind of wonder if they're going to be willing to take another shot on it if this doesn't work out. Web Sling, 1-cost skill, getting a point of power. It's an on reveal. One of your cards here at this location becomes movable, and every time it moves in that next turn, it'll get +1 point of power. Now, obviously, Multiple Man is already a deck that is pretty meaningfully decent right now at high infinite, a deck that is legitimately quite powerful if you are a sort of willing to invest in learning the patterns of it kind of gamer. And I will say that this definitely puts Web Sling a lot closer to the other 1-cost movers. My big worry for this deck is that I don't necessarily think that 1-cost movers are something the archetype is lacking. In fact, there are an astonishing array of 1-cost movers, from Ghost Spider to Iron Fist to Aranya, and now this. I cannot really figure out a lot of scenarios where I'd vastly prefer doing this over the others, except for one. There is one card that really wants to see additional power and can really do some cool things with it, and is, to boot, played in the Multiple Man decks. And that card is Iska. Iska the Unbeaten, being movable with an additional power, is one of the scariest things I've ever heard of in my entire life. Between Iska and Human Torch, there are multiple really good things to be hitting with something like this in those Multiple Man decks. And oh, by the way, it's not like hitting the Multiple Man is going to be bad either. This does seem like a card that will be able to outperform a couple of the other 1-cost movers. I can easily see this being better than Aranya. I can easily see this being better than Iron Fist. I think Ghost Spider is still going to be the cream of the crop, but this is definitely a card that I think can make it into a deck that I already have a lot of respect for. Nocturne to 3/5 is honestly probably the single change that I have argued against the most in public spaces. So it's incredibly funny that the very week they bring me on as a marketing contractor, they release Nocturne to 3/5. Just real sort of dramatic irony sense from the universe here. 3/5 Nocturne is super scary to me, not necessarily from a this card is going to be imbalanced perspective, but because of the way easily accessible location changers tend to flatten Marvel Snap's texture. A lot of people think that, I think it's a pretty common thing among my viewer base to say, I love reducing the amount of RNG in a game because all the things I lose to are RNG. I lose to this location being something that I can't really deal with. And Nocturne is a really good solve for that. But I think that in a world where she is solving for that stuff, what she's doing is removing a lot of the texture that makes Marvel Snap balanced, which is not to say literally balanced, but what I'm saying is you need, when you make a game, to have the worst player beat the good player some amount of the time. That's why we play card games. That's what the point of the chance element of a card game is. And I'm not saying Nocturne ruins that or anything. There's still chance in Marvel Snap, obviously. But she does sort of slant the game a little bit more towards the person who is executing better by reducing the impact of RNG on people. And that is not a problem when you're not paying when you're paying a premium for it. Like, if you have Scarlet Witch in your deck, if you have Nocturne in your deck, if you have Merlin in your deck, and these are all cards that are below rate for what they are. They're good, but they're below rate. And my worry with Nocturne is I think she's now on rate, and whenever she's good enough to play, like as a 3/5 movable, that's the kind of thing where it's like she's going to show up a bunch, and she's going to show up a bunch in ways that sort of make big swingy moments happen less. I personally think this is also kind of the first metagame in like 6 months where she's got a chance to be really good too. If this came out during Sholau, maybe it would have seen some Sholau play. If this came out during Star-Lord, I just don't think it's meaningfully doing enough, but it is still a reasonable enough card. But we're in a metagame right now where people are playing Copycat. We're in a metagame right now where Debris had to get nerfed. So we're pretty clearly in a metagame where people are in the market for good rate 3s. And this, to me, strikes me as just a very good rate 3. A 3/5 that moves is just good. A 3/5 that moves and gives me location control is even better. I will also say, I normally don't like talking about how every change relates to Cerebro, but Cerebro 5 getting location control is one of the biggest buffs it could possibly get. That's not necessarily going to say that it's going to be meta or anything like that, but the number one thing any Cerebro deck needs is location control. So it is a massive loss to Cerebro 4, in my opinion, and a massive buff to Cerebro 5. I do not think that the swap of Negasonic for Nocturne actually balances out. I think the Cerebro deck that gets the location control is going to end up being stronger almost no matter what because of the nature of what Cerebro is. So I will also say this. I think that I expect myself to be playing a decent amount of Nocturne, and maybe if we're go into another sort of like super heavy combo meta, maybe that won't be how it is. But right now, I just think this card is going to be pretty good. Last up, Topaz to 2/4. I think this is a very solid 2/4 candidate who, honestly, I wonder if she's maybe a little bit underrated at 2/4. I think 2/4 goes a really long way for me, and just like I will think about playing this card more. And it does seem like we might be headed into a move-oriented season next month, so Topaz could get a little bit of shine there. But it is possible that just being able to additionally move stuff at a 2/4 rate is just a good enough thing to do. Again, we already have a multiple man deck in this metagame. Topaz at 2/4 is a lot more reasonable of a card because it manages to justify its inclusion on its own terms, where Topaz at 2/3 genuinely does not. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous thing. Like, it sounds like crazy for me to care about, 3/4 Nocturne versus 3/5 Nocturne, or 2/3 Topaz versus 2/4 Topaz. But the difference in those cards to me is whether or not they justify their inclusion when they're not doing their thing. And when you're playing something below rate, you need to be getting value out of the thing that it's doing in order to justify its inclusion. But when you're playing something on rate or above rate, that's good enough. Like, that's just good enough to be in the deck anyway. And I think that, like, that kind of stuff is why I care this much about Topaz, about Nocturne, where it's like, I really do think that, like, individual point changes, especially really low on the curve, they are the kind of things that do matter. And I think there is a chance that this could. Not that Topaz is an especially powerful card, but it's just a lot easier to put her in your deck, especially if you're the multiple man deck that's like Juggernaut Cosmo deck. The extra points matter because you win close games. If you're like a combo deck and you're using this in, like, Living Tribunal, Human Torch stuff, it's not going to matter to you. But if you're playing like a Juggernaut Cosmo Negasonic type deck, then this matters to you. And that's actually kind of how people are playing multiple man right now. And I think that is really worth pointing out. All right, y'all, what do y'all think of this OTA? Before I let y'all go, I'm going to tell y'all a story. I got a bunch of comments that were like, KM, you stretched your face out. You look stretched on here. Something's wrong with your aspect ratio. I got to tell you, never upload anything on the internet because I double checked, I triple checked, nothing is stretched. I shaved and my face looks fatter. That's what my life is. My life is people telling me that I stretched my face when no, I shaved, and apparently I should never have done that. Anyway, y'all have a wonderful evening. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, except if you were asking if I stretched my face. Later.